Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Courtside Investor podcast. I'm your host, the Card Boss, and today we're going to talk about a question that one of the most popular questions that you guys have for me, which is basically how to value cards, and specifically cards that without comps. And for the purposes of this video, we're going to talk about a high-end card that we just recently sold on the Fanatics Collect Premier auction. So I reckon that card would be kind of like a good example to talk about. But before that, I just want to run through quickly, right, on why card valuation or your own card assessment is very important. Because in these days, we're kind of taking a bit too lightly on how we value cards, right? Because of the internet, because of so much data tools such as card ladder, market movers, we kind of like take the easy route, to value cards. Just look at what comps are. Then after that, make a multiplier. Call it 80%, 90%, 100%, depending on you guys, right? But to me, that's not really valuing a card. That's just looking at what was just previously sold. So the technique of valuing cards is actually quite a unique skill to have. And it's very important, especially when you have situations like this, where I'm going to talk about today, that you don't have an actual comp to look at, right? So of course, comps can be, to me, it acts as a guide for you to make sure that whatever valuation techniques that you actually put in, comes back to roughly about what the market is thinking. That's what comps is all about. But of course, sometimes in some situations that you have people willing to overpay, and then that gives to rise to, some, I would say, unusual comps. And of course, you also have to take into account the comp sometimes have data that's a bit incorrect or misleading, due to shilling, relisting, and stuff like that. Okay. So, but we're not going to cover that. We're going to talk about valuation techniques today. And I want you guys, take you guys on a journey, many, many years ago, 20 years, on why, I decided that I want to do my own valuations. And it's because of this. So when I first started off collecting basketball cards in 1993, right? So back then I was still ripping some packs, and I remember the set, 1993 Upper Deck Special Edition, and I actually pulled the insert, which is the box hit, which is the die cut all-star insert, and I pulled a Karl Malone, which is a box hit, okay, 1 in 36 packs. Now, back in the days, among friends, each of us have our favorite players. Like I collected Penny Hardaway, my friends who collected Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Chris Webber, and also had a friend who collected Karl Malone. Okay, so obviously, when I pulled this card, he wanted this to put into his collection. So I said, oh, that's fine. It was very common for us, to get into the playground, hit it up with our little binders, and then, to trade cards. And that's how we did it when we were 13 years old. But then he didn't have any Anthony Hardaway cards that I wanted, or I already had the ones that he had in his binder. But he really, really wanted a card. So I said, okay, fine. Maybe trade me something else, that maybe I could use to trade later on. So, of course, back then, if I was any smarter, I would trade something of equal value. But the problem was you didn't really know what equal value was back then, okay, 1993. So he said, look, I'm going to give you this Vin Baker Fleer Ultra All Rookies insert. Now, Vin Baker was the same rookie class as Penny Hardaway, 1993. I think it was like the 8th pick by the Milwaukee Bucks. Okay, now he was an up and comer. Eventually, he turned out to be quite a decent player, and was part of a trade that went to the Supersonics for Sean Kemp. But Karl Malone was an established player. We knew about the Utah Jazz and the Mailman, Stockton connection, all of that. But I really, really wanted to help my friend, but it didn't feel like a fair deal. So he said, yep, no worries. I'm going to toss in something else. And he gave me a Kenny Anderson all rookies insert or something along those lines, right? Kenny Anderson was playing for the New Jersey Nets. I think he made All-Star the season before. So I reckon like, all right, just 2 for 1. And then, just gave a card and I picked up these 2 cards. So that was fine for a moment. And then I went on to meet up another friend a bit later and then I tell him, look, I pulled this card and then I did this trade. And then he pulled out a book and then he looked at it. I think you got screwed, dude. It's like, what do you mean? It's like, the Karl Malone you gave, had a value that more than double of what you received. And I said, what do you mean more than double? How do you determine values? And there he showed me the Beckett magazine, right? The price guide. So there was the Bible or the book that tells people how to value cards. Somebody put prices and people used to trade based on that. Okay, so since then, even myself, we used the Beckett price guide for many, many years to do trades, to buy and sell. Of course, we then apply percentages, like 50% of the Beckett price and things like that. That's all very normal. But fast forward the 30 plus years to today, we're doing exactly the same thing, right? Aside from it being a Beckett price guide form, we will now have data tools such as market movers, such as card ladder, and we're applying percentage points. There is no thinking behind it. There's not much consideration behind it. Okay, just look at what COMPS is, applies a multiplier depending on you, how much you want a card, whether is it you want it for your PC or for your collection or for your to resell and whatnot. So coming back to the situation, what if the card doesn't have a comp or anything recent comp, right? You could have a comp that's 5 years ago, which is technically invalid, right? Due to pandemic times and things like that. So without recent comp, how do you value? Do you want the card, but you can't decide on how much is fair to pay or to trade for. So this is the purpose of this video. Okay, so my background before I did cards full time is basically in corporate finance, where it's my day job to value companies to buy. So I know a thing or two about valuation. And when it comes to buying companies, there is no comps, right? There is no, when you want to buy a company, there isn't one that's easily a carbon copy of one that was actually sold previously. You have to apply different valuation techniques to consider things such as the internals of the company and as well as external factors like what the market is and things like that. So no different from actually looking at cards, to be honest, right? You may think that it sounds crazy, but actually there is some level of consideration to be weighed in. So we're going to talk about this particular 1998 Star Rubies Kobe PSA 7 that sold on the Premier for $56,000 and $56,400. Okay, I'm going to look at double screen here, get some more information. So this card is a Pop 2, despite it being a PSA 7, none higher. There are some BGS copies available. I think there's a BGS 9, but the general consensus is for cards that's around in this period, 1997, 1998, especially for the PMGs, the Rubies. Generally, a BGS 9 and a PSA 7 is fairly comparable. I have not seen a card in hand, to be honest, to actually make that comparison, but most people in hobby actually determine that a PSA 7 is very close to a BGS 9, or at least a BGS 8.5. So keep that in mind for this particular video, because we're going to look at some of the prices of BGS 9 versus PSA 7, okay, for that matter. Now, touching back on this particular Kobe, like I mentioned, it was Pop 2, none higher. And there are two recent comps sold for PSA 6. One on Card Hobby was about a month ago for about $33,000 plus, and there's another one on Fanatics for $36,000. Okay, so one thing that we do know, a PSA 7 is worth more than a PSA 6, that's for sure. So the question is how much more? So when you talk about modern cards, people say, look, if we start off with a PSA 10, imagine a PSA 10 is $1,000. You apply a PSA 9, rule of thumb, 50%, right? So it's about, let's say, $500. And then maybe you apply a PSA 8, maybe 80% of that amount. So let's say $400, right? And maybe a PSA 7, you apply maybe another 80% on that. So maybe $320. So if you think about it, PSA 7s versus a PSA 10 is generally about like 30% of the value, which is maybe okay. But for modern card, I think that's a bit less, because people say that anything that's less than a PSA 8 raw is even better. But when you talk about something that's in the 90s, it's a completely different story. PSA 6 is considered a decent grade. Decent. All right, PSA 7 is an above average, and PSA 8 is considered amazing. So look at these kind of cards here, the PMGs, the Star Rubies. If you get a PSA 8, it's almost as good as PSA 10. It's not gem mint, but it's perceived to be almost there. All right, so if you get a PSA 7, it's almost like a PSA 9. Okay. Now, of course, for this particular Star Rubies, there isn't a PSA 8 to be benchmarked against. That would make things very easy, correct? So we have to look at what the next level is, which is the PSA 6. So we talk about PSA 6, being roughly about 80% of the value of the PSA 7, and you would say that the PSA 6 is roughly about like 35K roughly, you would probably attribute the PSA 7 to be around 45, 44K roughly, working backwards on this particular example. Okay. Fair enough assumption, but how do we test the assumption, right? So we're going to look at all the others, maybe some other comparables, because we don't have comparable for Kobe. So we look at others. Let's say, for example, when you talk about in the 90s, you have Jordan, you have Kobe, you have Shaquille O'Neal, and then you have maybe a class of Allen Iverson, Tim Duncan, maybe Dennis Rodman, you can throw in there, Kevin Garnett as well. Okay, so these are the normal players that you use to value a card in this class. So obviously Jordan's are different, as well as this particular Kobe is actually a subset, not the main base card. Okay, so for this 97 Skybox, there is two classes of Star Rubies. There is a base and there's a subset. For Jordan, there isn't a subset, there's only the base. So we're going to skip Jordan, I'm going to look at Shaquille O'Neal. Now, Shaquille O'Neal, the recent insert, which I have sold on okay, was a BGS 9 that recently sold for $16,000. Okay, and if you look at COMPS, okay, let me just try and pull this up. We have a PSA 7, maybe, let me look. A PSA 6 that recently sold for $12,000, but that was a jersey number. And we had another, the next nearest one, PSA 6, much earlier, was for about $13,000. Okay. So there isn't a PSA 7 in direct comparison that we could use aside from the one that you can see here that recently sold on Leland's. Okay, but Leland's, again, it's kind of a niche auction house. You know, generally you want to look at the more broader auction houses like Fanatics, Codeine, or eBay, right? So technically, there isn't much I can draw comparisons from Shaquille O'Neal, but one thing that I can actually look here to, kind of use this as a base example is to consider the base card version that's sold in June for $21,900, okay, versus the BGS 9. Okay, I mentioned BGS 9 and PSA 7 of the subset that sold for close to $17,000. And you determine based on the percentages, it's roughly about a 40% markup compared to the subset. So the subset marks up about 40% to arrive at the base. Okay, so that's another key point that we know. I want to look at other players. I didn't see any Allen Iversons that we could look at. Okay, but I did find Kevin Garnett, which is interesting. Okay, so we look at Kevin Garnett. If you look at the subset version that recently sold on the Phoenix Premier as well for $6,300, that's for the subset version. And then there was another version, the base version, that sold for $15,000 in May on the Phoenix Weekly. And there's just one when, at the time of this recording, just recently, so a couple of hours ago, was the base version PSA 6 as well that sold for about 15, I think. The last time I tracked, definitely more than 15 for sure. Okay. So we look at the subset versus the base version, that is like easily a 2 times multiplier. So we're looking at a 40% markup to a 2 times multiplier. Okay, so given the little points in mind, okay, we want to see what the incremental value between the 6 and the 7 is. So for Kevin Garnett, we don't have a 6 and a 7 for the subset version, but we do have the incremental versions between the base versions between the 6 and the 7. So the 7, which is Kevin Garnett, I think it's a low pop 2 as well, that sold for $27,000 in April of this year, and versus the PSA 6 that's sold for about $15,000. So you're looking at roughly about another 40% markup between the 6 and the 7. So we were getting on to something like here. So they're within the 40% to the 2x range, 40% to being conservative between the PSA 6 to the PSA 7, and between the base to the between the subset to the base versions. Okay, so hopefully you guys are still following me on this one. Now coming back to the Kobe, so I mentioned that Kobe, we have roughly only the PSA 6 on the subset, and ranging between 33, 36, let's call it roughly about 35. And the nearest base version of the Kobe was sold on Phoenix Premier, a PSA 6 version in July for $96,000. Okay, so if you want to apply a reverse backwards, what would be a PSA 6 of the subset version, given the price of 96K on this particular base version, you'd probably be looking at maybe about like $60,000, okay? Which is technically not accurate because you have a subset version sold on Card Hobby for just 33 and then the Fanatics at 36K. So if you're talking about 2x, like the other SKU, let me look at the Garnet, okay? So we should put the subset version of PSA 6 roughly about like close to $48,000. Now that sounds more like it, okay? So coming back to this PSA 7, so if you want to consider the aesthetic version of the aesthetics of the card, it's awesome looking image of Kobe, okay? Fanatics Collect has this nice rotating video of the card, just really brings out the shine, brings out the shimmer. Obviously, this is a super high eye appeal. And when you factor in that it's a Pop 2 non-higher, PSA slabs generally much more preferred. You have this thing as a very, all the makings of a potential investment piece. So based on all the information that we gathered earlier, we can say that the fair value of this PSA 7, okay, based on just numbers wise, it's probably close to maybe about like 50K roughly, okay, based on some of the calculations that I did. But when you apply the fact that there is a non-higher, Pop 2 non-higher, we apply the fact that there is, it's a PSA slab, and of course the aesthetics, of course this is tier 1 Kobe and whatnot. So I reckon that this card, definitely takes it above and beyond that number for sure. Okay, so it's not going to be valued at 60, 70K if based on some of the calculations that I did. Okay, but somewhere between the 50 to 60 mark, which is what I think that this would probably land. And in fact, it truly did land at the $56,000 mark. So I wouldn't think that in this particular instance it's an overpay, because given that I mentioned the PSA 7 is the highest grade available, it's almost as good as a BGS 9. So it has everything positive going for it to be a top quality card, and that's what actually that's what you want to have when you want to be paying premiums on a certain card. So for people that's I would say doesn't have the necessary skills, right? And they look at the comps, it's gonna be a very simple markup for them, to look at. Okay, I'm gonna take what a PSA 6 is, I'm gonna put 20% on top, okay, and make it a simple 43, and then it starts scratching your head, wondering why would somebody pay $56,000 instead of roughly about 43, 44K? And these are the reasons what I just mentioned, and I think that whoever bought this card, it's not too far off in terms of valuation. Okay, is it setting a new bar that perhaps if let's say people were to look at the card and say, look, I think that this card is only about 50K. Yeah, for say what you want, right? It's a Pop 2. There's only one other guy that's gonna own this card. Now, if I think it's worth 56 and you believe your card's worth 50, that's fine. But it's only two of us that's actually determining the value card, and there's nobody else that's above us. And that's the strength of owning a card like this, a premier card for Kobe, the highest grade available for Kobe in a PSA slab. Awesome looking photo. It's worth the valuation. And typically, when you want to value cards that has no comps, it's not just about multipliers. It's about figuring out all the other things that surround the particular card. Okay, that's it for this exercise. I hope that you guys didn't go in circles. I hope you guys didn't get more confused in this. But definitely, when it comes to big cards like this, people value cards a bit differently. Maybe that something that to think about and see whether or not you could apply certain kind of techniques to value these kind of cards. Again, this is not a formula. It's just a methodology for you to think about. For me, I apply it regularly, especially looking at cards like this. And I wouldn't say I've never been off. Definitely, I've been off in certain instances. But this is one thing that if you do it regularly, and then you get a lot of practice into it, and you get to see some results into it, you're going to be able to find this as a useful tool going forward. All right, that's it for this one. Do comment. You have any other further questions? Feel for me to happy to answer any of those questions to you guys. Like, subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys. Till the next one. Cowboys out.